Alright, so let's jump right in. So before you even begin, I would highly recommend doing 10 to 15 minutes of warm-up sketches just to get your artistic brain warmed up and ready to take on the artwork. When starting, you really want to make sure to keep your lines and shapes as simple as you can just to get in the composition. This, however, does require a fundamental understanding about how to break down the human form down into basic shapes and forms. Then when getting to details, I always start with the eyes. The eyes are pretty much the essential point for me to add in the sort of personality that sets the tone for the rest of the face. For the hair, I love playing around with flowing shapes and lines, balancing them out in a way where there's a variety of busy and resting areas based on largely S-shaped type curves. So when inking, I always start with the eyes. That is something I make sure to take my time with because that is something I cannot afford to mess up. My lines are basically created with single continuous strokes mixed in with multiple strokes to build up a single line. Then you'll notice I'm also moving my page around just to make the most out of my wrist's natural arc motion. Now with things like the details of the chain, this is not something that you want to rush. It might be a bit tedious, but trust me, the results are going to be worth it if you take your time. For the outline, its thickness is dependent on how important I want something to stand out, which I build up in multiple strokes with a fine liner just because, hey, I like the texture. For color, I first add light base tones for which I can build a range of shadow on by reapplying the markers over themselves. Now, when adding flat areas, you want to be fairly quick as the wet ink blends best together. Large areas can be pretty tricky, so I try to reduce their size by filling in other smaller areas that I know I'll need to add shadow on to break its flatness. That makes the larger shrinked areas more manageable to deal with. So you can see there's some streakiness. I'm not too worried about that because I know I'm going to be going over that to sort that out. And always make sure before doing any flatting that your markers are loaded with ink. Now, when working with shinier surfaces such as the mask and the hair, you need to be aware of your light source from the start. Now, I've already decided that the primary light source is going to be coming towards her just off center on the left from above her eyeline, supported by a secondary backlight that is creating that rim light around her. So when dealing with the shine of the hair, understanding how and where the light source will hit the angle of the curves is crucial. The focus is more about what I leave white as the shine versus the color I'm actually adding in. And you can see I've brought in my fine liner once again just to add a deeper contrast and more texture. So when adding shadow, you want to be very sure where exactly you are adding this and why you're adding it there in relation to your light source. So right now I'm just being very minimal with my sort of selection of where I'm adding my shadows just to keep it on the simple side. You'll also notice that I'm using a gray to go in with the shadows right now, and that's just to keep the shadows cool. Okay, so when going in with black shiny surfaces, this can be quite intimidating just because you are forced to make very bold decisions. That's why I gradually build my way there through working with the lighter shades to get a better feel for where I'll be adding those darker shades. You'll also see that I've decided to make the mask itself more on the shiny side, which is why it has those sort of whiter highlights, whereas her costume itself is a bit more on the matte side, which is why there are no white highlights. Now, I'm about to add a green outline for a touch more color variation, but let's talk about that costume shine. Okay, so shiny material is definitely more sensitive to light, reflections, and bounce light, but in this case, we've just kept to light and bounce light influences from our primary light source, with bounce light coming from below. Now, the key to effectively being able to capture the harder edge sort of nature of the shine is just a matter of doing a lot of studies from reference and getting into those fundamentals. Now, at this point, I'm wanting to actually start finishing things up by increasing the darkness here, and then I add some tone to the background just to help strengthen the framing of her. I now move into some final highlights on the eyes, nose, and lips with a gel pen, and then carefully go in with a pencil around the highlights just to add some contrast. And then just out of personal preference, I add some reds to the darkest darks just to bring some extra life and a little bit more color variation. Alright, there we have it. She is now complete, but I would like to leave you with these final notes. Alright, so the key in creating a visually appealing artwork is to make sure that the underlying structure has a strong sense of composition. You want to make sure that whatever form you are drawing, that it silhouettes well, and hey, if you want, you can add a frame to take that a bit further. So when creating any poses, you always want to be aware of the flow lines that are running throughout your characters just for a more natural look. Then when defining your perspective, you first have to establish your eye level so that anything above it you're looking up at and below it you're looking down onto, as the vanishing point is able to show us. Then I can't stress how important it is to be able to learn how to break down the human form into basic shapes and have that as your foundation to then add anatomy on top of. And lastly, when you get to your coloring, you want to make sure that you define a primary light source and make sure that that lighting is consistent throughout. And hey, adding a secondary light source always makes things a little bit more interesting. Alright, well that is a wrap, so thank you for watching and take care everyone. Much love.